So during the Enlightenment, one of the genres, one of the styles of art that we see that really kind of begins to come into its own is landscape painting. Landscape painting is something that isn't entirely new. We've seen examples of this previously, but these are typically cases where we have a landscape that includes some other sort of figure or something else going on, some other kind of context. And for the first time, really during the Enlightenment, landscape begins to really kind of come into its own. And we see this clearly evidenced in the paintings of a couple specific people. One of these is definitely Turner. Another we might consider to really be central to this idea would be Bierstadt, who's one of the Hudson River School painters from the Americas. So we're going to begin here today by taking a careful look at several examples of these artists and talking about how their artwork really reflects some of these key ideas when it comes to landscape painting during the Enlightenment. So the first artist that we're going to look at is Caspar David Friedrich. Caspar David Friedrich was a German Romanticist painter, and he's well known for imagery that tends to kind of border on the gloomy. It's beautiful and haunting, but sometimes rather dark. So Friedrich came from a kind of a difficult background. Had a lot of loss in his lifetime. He actually lost his mother when he was 7 years old. She died. And then two of his sisters died before he was 18 years old. And also his brother drowned while trying to rescue him in an ice skating accident. So he was brought up by his father in really a very strict puritanical setting. And we kind of see some of that severity, I think, kind of come through in his painting. He actually had an opportunity to go to Rome and study abroad, but decided not to because he was afraid that it would kind of taint or compromise his style, his art. He never really achieved any significant recognition or wealth. Kind of died in obscurity. The image that you see here represents really probably his pinnacle. This is one of two paintings. The other is called The Monk and the Sea, and these two paintings were hung together actually for the Academy in Germany, the German Academy. And the paintings were both actually purchased by the King of Prussia at the time. And so this particular example here is really probably kind of intended to be evocative of what was going on in Europe during this period in history, as well as probably giving us some idea or insight into Friedrich himself. But the image that we see here is of the ruins of an abbey, also situated in a graveyard. And so this is kind of intended to, I think, represent for us the state of Germany and maybe Europe as a whole, given the wars that had been going on in recent years over the past decades, including the Napoleonic invasion of Germany, the War of Liberation that came later. And so I think this is intended to kind of show this sense of destruction and ruin. And so the meaning of this really is kind of partially about this idea of loss, loss of the grandeur of the past, but also when paired with its companion piece, with The Monk and the Sea, it does give some glimmer of hope, a possible positive outcome in the long term. The most famous of all of the Romanticist landscape painters is Joseph Mallord or William Turner. And the image that we're looking at here, known as the Slave Ship, commonly, or by its full title, which is Slavers Throwing Overboard the Dead and Dying Typhoon Coming On, painted in 1840, is a classic example, really, of his style and what his work was really all about. Turner was born to kind of humble beginnings. His father was a barber who would sometimes hang his paintings in the window for display. Actually had a very close relationship with his father. But Turner was really kind of a loner, kind of an outsider. He did manage to become one of the youngest members of the Royal Academy, trained there, and became fairly well known for his landscapes and seascapes that were based kind of in the techniques of the old masters. But he ends up kind of shifting his style and technique. And his later work is what he's really best known by today. But in many cases, this was just kind of beyond the comprehension of the critics, really, of his day. So when we look at the image that we see here, one of the things that's really apparent is that Turner is not out to capture an image in the traditional style and technique of the old masters. He's attempting to capture really the feeling, the sensation of these overwhelming forces of nature, of power, And he always claimed that he was doing this as a means of direct observation, that he was painting what he saw. But sometimes his paintings almost border on incomprehensible, as we'll see in another image here in a moment. But this image, as well as being incredibly powerful visually and beautiful, also really conveys a very strong content and narrative. The image that we're looking at here, the slave ship, is about really kind of a fairly horrific activity. During this period in history, slavers would capture slaves, obviously, and then transport them by ship to wherever they were taking them for sale. And they typically would carry insurance. They would have insurance on their cargo, on their goods, which, of course, in this case, we're referring to the slaves. Now, if a slave was lost overboard and vanished, you would receive insurance. However, if you showed up in port with sick or dead slaves, that was a financial loss. Simple as that. You wouldn't receive any insurance money for those. It was simply something that would come directly off of your bottom line. So it was common practice for these slavers that prior to pulling into port with their cargo, they would take any individuals who were ill, were sick, or any obviously who had died along the way, and would throw them overboard. And this was a horrific act, and they did this simply because it was a way for them to save a little extra money and improve their bottom line. So the image we're looking at here, Snowstorm at Sea, is one of Turner's last works. And Turner really became much more eccentric as he grew older. And this painting was certainly not met with any sort of popular accolades. In fact, the critics really kind of shredded him about this one. One of them claimed that it looked like it had been painted with soap suds and whitewash, or cream of chocolate, yolk of egg, and currant jelly. And Turner was really quite hurt by this. And he replied to a friend of his about this. He said, I wonder what they think the sea is like. I wish they'd been in it. He actually had himself strapped to the mast of a ship in order to do this, in order to see this event, see this snowstorm at sea. Again, it's this incredibly powerful rendition of nature. So the image, again, was based on his own personal experiences. And he didn't paint it because he wanted people to understand it, but rather to see what it was like and to experience it. Turner lived with his father for about 30 years, but other than that, really didn't have any close friends. He didn't allow anyone to see him, to watch him while he painted, and he rarely sold any of his paintings. And actually, he was really very personally attached to his works, and whenever he would actually sell a painting, he would be depressed about it for days. So one day he just kind of vanished from his house and nobody could find him. And after an extensive search, his housekeeper found him hiding in a house in Chelsea, and he had been sick for some time. And so he died the following day. Turner actually left a fairly large fortune, which was, in his words, to be used to help out and support decaying artists, and left all of his paintings to his country, and then was eventually buried in St. Paul's Cathedral. So the next painter that we're looking at here is Thomas Cole, and this is probably his best known painting, called the Oxbow, or also known as The View from Mount Holyoke, Northampton, Massachusetts, after a thunderstorm. Cole is really kind of one of the central figures of early American painting, and certainly American landscape painting. He's considered to be the father of the Hudson River School of painting. Cole was actually born in England, came to the United States when he was about 17 years old, and initially tried doing portrait painting, but pretty quickly discovered that he was very interested in landscape. He's best known for these types of realistic but somewhat romantic landscapes, but also painted a lot of allegorical imagery as well. So the image that we see here is an image of the Oxbow, which is this natural formation of the Connecticut River, which he was really fascinated by. And so here, Cole is actually, he's painted in the image. He's actually in his own painting here in the foreground, just barely visible as he's there working at a canvas and painting. But the image is intended to kind of represent the possible directions of the American civilization in a metaphorical way. You have this dark, brooding cloud on the left-hand side and jagged lightning on this, darkened image. And on the right-hand side, we have the light breaking through, and it's much more, positive, feeling on the right. And it's really quite apt too. When we think about the fact this is painted, a couple decades really before the Civil War, and it's also really kind of a good example of Cole's ability to capture this kind of beautiful and very naturalistic imagery. So the painting that we're looking at here is by Albert Bierstadt, and it's called Among the Sierra Nevada Mountains, California, from 1868. It's a large-scale painting. It's about 6 feet high and 10 feet wide. Bierstadt is really well known for doing these enormous paintings that are representative of the American West, and really are closely associated with the idea, the concept of manifest destiny. So Bierstadt was born in Germany, but grew up in Massachusetts. And he actually accompanied a U.S. overland expedition. And they mapped a route from St. Louis all the way to the Pacific Ocean. And while he did that, he did a lot of sketches and drawings. And later came back, and in his own studio, he worked from sketches and also from photographs, and created these incredibly beautiful, striking images of the American West. One of the things that's kind of interesting, though, is he didn't really capture any of these places in a realistic way. He would select pieces and mix and match and invent a landscape, really, with different elements that he'd captured from different locations, and create these incredibly beautiful, fantastic, but fictitious landscapes like we see here. So this is Frederick Edwin Church, and this painting is called Twilight in the Wilderness from the 1860s. Church was actually one of the students of Cole, and was very interested in these, large-scale spectacles of nature. He traveled around quite a bit too. He painted in South America, and Mexico, Europe, the Middle East, Newfoundland. It is kind of interesting, though, to note that this beautiful, idyllic, calm image was painted right smack in the middle of the Civil War, and shows really no evidence of the horrors or of the strife that was taking place in the country at the time.